Live from deep in an underground bunker in East Tennessee, this is America's premier mortgage field services expert, Paul Williams.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome back another edition of Foreclosurepedia Podcast. Foreclosurepedia Podcast is a presentation of the Foreclosurepedia Radio Network, which premieres each Sunday evening. It's the 11th of September, 2016, the 15th anniversary since terrorist attack upon the World Trade Center towers. There's a lot of discussion going on out there tonight about that, about those terrorists, and depending upon which side of the aisle you come from, I guess you'd have a difference of opinion upon whom those terrorists may be. One thing is for certain, though, ladies and gentlemen, it was an abominable act. Prayers of myself, D. Paul Williams, Editor-in-Chief, Foreclosurepedia.org, and the Foreclosurepedia Nation go out to the victims. Another thing that we know for sure, another thing that we know, which is certain, just as certain as the sun will rise, that the National Association of Mortgage Field Services regime recently met down in Dallas, Texas. When they met down there, they came together as a group that I can only term as financial terrorists, ladies and gentlemen. Make no mistake about that whatsoever. Albeit novel in their presentation of the new Small Penis Brigade, Eric Miller and his merry band of financial terrorists were down hawking the wares like some whore in the Soho district. Pushing compliance. How dare they? You know, ladies and gentlemen, I have right here in my hand, right here in the Foreclosurepedia Nation Studios, a report in front of me. This report is entitled The $160 Billion Bank Fee. $160 billion is what the financial institutions have had to pay back for their crimes and their atrocities committed upon the common man. So I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get right back on that at the top of the hour. In the meantime, I want to give a shout out to my son, Darius. Darius up there in Tennessee, he just recently watched the Tennessee Volunteers rout the Virginia Tech Hokies 45-24. I want to say hi to my son, and I'm hoping that the Volunteers this year are not going to once again send some more boys to the penitentiary and keep their eye on the ball. We'll be back right after this. So we're back, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, the date is the 11th September 2016. The time, 2018 hours Eastern Daylight Time. And, before we get into this, it's an astonishing report by a Philip Matera, goodjobsfirst.org. It's out of Washington, D.C., corporate research project of Good Jobs First. You can reach Phil Matera at corp-research.org or goodjobsfirst.org. It's monumental. It's monumental, but I really want to lay the backdrop, because here's the true irony. Within the mortgage field services industry today, there is an enormous downward momentum of pressure upon labor. These are the common men and women whom cut the grass to pay $80 to $100 per year per company to have a background check performed upon they. That's through Aspen Grove Solutions. Ironically, that identical background check, if you go to become a general contractor in the state of Arizona, for example, is $7.30. And the people within the industry, one would think everybody should have a background check performed by Aspen Grove. It's not required. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, there is no law, no rule, no regulation whatsoever that requires background checks to perform field services in this industry. That is a salient fact. In fact, Foreclosurepedia reached out directly to Susan Bunnell, the Senior General Counsel, Senior Vice President of Wells Fargo, and asked her that. Did Wells Fargo require background checks? Absolutely not. We reached out to Craig Carnes, the director at the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, in charge of post-conveyance properties, and asked, were background checks required by the U.S. government? Absolutely not, to perform field services. There is no law. And let's talk about public law for just a moment. Let's talk about what Eric Miller, the fraudster in chief of the National Association of Mortgage Field Services regime, what was his narrative? Oh, Dodd-Frank required it. But in fact, not only in what he was talking about was Regulation Z, because he didn't even know what section. I brought that up to Counselor Bunnell. She and I both concurred it was in there nowhere. Eric Miller's new game, the new narrative that he had to run for cover on, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. I reached out to they. No law, rule, or regulation they ever knew of. They're actually concerned that the NAMFS regime was pushing a false narrative and might potentially be using the cloak and mantle of a United States government agency to enrich themselves. Eric Miller and his merry band of financial terrorists then ran for cover with the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I dealt with a senior investigator out of the state of New York, whom as well could cite me no law, rule, or regulation. The NAMFS regime is a nonprofit business league, a 501c6, whom in turn created a nonprofit 501c3 known as the NAMFS Academy. The NAMFS Academy is out there attempting to prostitute a belief that this industry can train people. But we have a problem there. See, we already have run afoul of half a dozen federal laws, rules, and regulations, and by proxy, municipal, county, and state laws. This completely pedestrian and sophomoric belief that one has to purchase every year for every company an $80+ background check to cut grass is the epitome of precisely why I state that Eric Miller represents no one other than financial terrorists whom are here operating in the United States of America, ladies and gentlemen. As Aspen Grove Solutions, began to figure out that they had an unmilked cow. And that cow was not simply just labor, but was comprised of very unsophisticated minorities and females, like a wolf in the chicken pen. So came Aspen Grove. Aspen Grove, a foreign national, came a-calling at the behest of two people, Mr. Eric Miller, the fraudster and chief of the National Association of Mortgage Field Services regime, and Jim Taylor at Wells Fargo. Oh yes, let us not forget Jim Taylor. We broke the story several years back. We had people at that conference. And in fact, between Jim and Eric, there were no questions to be allowed. The agenda merely needed the rubber stamping of that committee. And that is a direct quote from the chairman, the person who headed up that committee, ladies and gentlemen. The NAMFS Academy, which is a 501c3, is now controlled by Aspen Grove Solutions, a for-profit foreign national corporation. Sean Ryan is not a U.S. citizen. His cronies are not U.S. citizens. As surely as I sit in front of you tonight, ladies and gentlemen, speaking through this microphone, Aspen Grove Solutions must go. When they took over the NAMFS Academy website, for 30-some days, they forgot to pay the bill for the HTTPS certificate. This is a salient fact. It's on the Foreclosurepedia.org website. These are the people, ladies and gentlemen, whom have your social security numbers, your dates of birth, your address, your employment history, your education, marital status, your children's names, your financial information, ladies and gentlemen. They forgot to pay the bill for over a month. Google took the extreme measure of making you go through advanced settings to even reach the website. Ladies and gentlemen, we find ourselves today at war. The posture of labor must become elevated. And what do I mean exactly by that posture of labor? If you go over to dirtdiggersdigest.org, go into the archives, 5353, it's an article, it's an incredible article, and it's entitled, Fighting Wage Theft in the Senate Cafeterias. Now I'm quoting Phil Matera here. The Department of Labor found that restaurant associates and its subcontractor Personnel Plus have been violating the McNamara-O'Hara Service Contract Act by improperly classifying food service workers in the United States. Senate cafeterias in order to pay them less than their proper wage. The employer was also found to be engaging in wage theft by requiring workers to begin their duties prior to scheduled starting times without compensation. DOL announced that hundreds of the workers will receive back pay in excess of $1 million. Now I want to read just a part out of this second paragraph so you truly understand why labor is at war. Credit for the case belongs largely to the workers themselves, who for the past 2 years have been agitating about unfair working conditions with the help of Good Jobs Nation. And ladies and gentlemen, so let me just give you an example of how stark the reclassification made the pay. A cook was getting $12.30 an hour. That jumped to $17.45 an hour. Now, I want that to set in just a moment, ladies and gentlemen. And for all of you folks out there who are running order mills and you're hanging out in your little drama book and all that, here's the reality. Here's the reality. It's over. It is done. Labor is coming together. Labor is coming together, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back in a moment after a word from our sponsors, and we're going to get into the $160 billion bank-free report that was just put out in June. We'll be right back after this. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm back. The show prep, it's always going on. I just got this in right now. We're talking this evening, ladies and gentlemen, about the $160 billion in fines. $160 billion fines, penalties in 144 cases brought against 26 of the largest U.S. and foreign banks. This is the irony. The true irony in what's going on in America today, and this industry most specifically, the true irony is that everything is always pushed down upon the shoulders of the minorities. It's always the minorities' fault, something they have done. Somehow they owe. It is always labor's fault, something they have done, therefore they owe. Let me read off a couple of these numbers. Incidentally, this is coming from Paul Matera, report he put out in June. Let's talk about 57 cases of toxic securities and mortgage abuses. Doesn't sound like a lot, does it? 118 billion, 351,000. In fines. Violations of rules prohibiting businesses with enemy countries, $15,281,854. Manipulation of the foreign exchange markets, $7,386,000 in fines. Assisting tax evasion. You're not supposed to be able to work in the industry if you've committed tax evasion. $2,353,633. So that does bring, and that's actually, ladies and gentlemen, that's simply just 2 cases. So it raises the question, how is it precisely that Eric Miller of the NAMFS regime, how can he and his financial terrorists allow the banks even to be in the industry? Because if we have these laws that say you can't do this, my bad, I'm sorry. It's mortgage field services industry. I'm going to tell you, the manipulation of energy markets, a million, discrimination in the millions, money laundering. I tell you, it makes me sick. It makes me extremely sick, ladies and gentlemen. So, like Paul calls them, I'm going to call them the same, the $1 billion club. Because I'm going to tell you what, Bank of America, how much do they pay in fines? Anybody out there curious? $56 billion. JP Morgan, $28 billion. Citigroup, $15. Wells, $10. Goldman, $9 billion. Morgan Stanley, $4 billion. I just, Jesus Christ. But the other thing that I thought that prevented all of us of working within this industry was if you are a felon and you've been convicted of financial crimes. That's right, because you see, Citicorp, JP Morgan Chase and Company, Barclays, Royal Bank of Scotland, it's RBS, and you'll see it on your work order, and UBS have all agreed to plead guilty to felony charges. Now, this isn't just run-of-the-mill blog. This is from the Federal Bureau of Investigation by and through the Office of the Public Affairs of the United States Department of Justice, the 20th of May, 2015. So once again, we have background checks for contractors who are cutting grass. But the very people committing the crimes, people whom Eric Miller knows personally, has broken bread with personally, has been under his command and control within the National Association of Mortgage Field Services, I don't know. You know, I just really do not know. How about Homestar? How about Michael Breeze? Eric, what say you on that? Oh, that's right, ladies and gentlemen. You can hear those crickets there. You know why? Because Eric won't say anything. Because he can't. Because the minute that he does say something, the minute that he gets a pair of balls that are so shriveled up, you'd think that he's on some type of, chemical treatment. The minute that he says something, the monies that he is receiving to unjustly enrich himself upon the backs of labor and minorities, money dries up. Money drives up, I'm going to tell you what, ladies and gentlemen, I got a hard break pressing on me. We'll be back right after this. We're going to get a little bit deeper in. We're actually going to talk a little bit more about what precisely is going on within the industry. We're going to talk about CWIS. We're going to ask how their money flow is doing, because I hear it's drying up. Just like everything else that's present upon Carolyn Ramagos. Neither here nor there. We'll be right back after this. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. As usual, you may reach me on Google Plus at D. Paul Williams, LinkedIn, Paul Williams, and the LinkedIn group Property Preservation Consortium, Twitter, Foreclosurepedia. We stream all our podcasts on iTunes, Foreclosurepedia. We have our screencasts over on YouTube, the Foreclosurepedia channel, and always at foreclosurepedia.org. We'd like to give a special shout out to Amazon.com, whom provides our S3 podcast and video storage, and Cloudflare for hosting Foreclosurepedia in 24 different geo-positioned servers, pro bono as well. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to give me a shout out, COO at foreclosurepedia.org. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. As usual, you may reach me on Google Plus at D. Paul Williams, LinkedIn, Paul Williams, and the LinkedIn group Property Preservation Consortium, Twitter, Foreclosurepedia. We stream all our podcasts on iTunes, Foreclosurepedia. We have our screencasts over on YouTube, the Foreclosurepedia channel, and always at foreclosurepedia.org. We'd like to give a special shout out to Amazon.com, whom provides our S3 podcast and video storage, and Cloudflare for hosting Foreclosurepedia in 24 different geo-positioned servers, pro bono as well. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to give me a shout out, COO at foreclosurepedia.org.